All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Eric Clay. I'm the VP of Marketing at Flare, and I have two very distinguished guests with me for a very exciting webinar on offensive security, cyber threat intelligence, language models. We're hitting all of the buzzwords. Nick and Jason, would you guys mind introducing yourselves?
Sure. Jason, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. My name is Jason Haddix. I'm the field CISO at Flare and the head consultant and trainer at Arcanum Information Security. So I've been with Flare for, Eric, I want to say about 3 months now, right? I'm hitting
Yeah,
the
about 3 months.
Yeah. And, before I was with Flare, I was a full-time red teamer. And I've been in offensive security for about 19 years. So really into the attack surface management space, really into the AI space right now. Just, all of that new tech is really, really cool to me. I like doing head first deep dives into research. And so I used Flare at my red teaming job in the past, and I fell in love with them and decided that I would come work with Eric and the team here at Flare. And so I couldn't be happier, honestly.
Awesome.
And Nick?
I'm Nick Ascoli. I am the senior product strategist here at Flare. I am coming from the acquisition of Fortrace. I was the founder of Fortrace. I brought the product originally to market and built the team around it, and now am very excited to say, if you kept up with Flare news, that Flare recently acquired Fortrace. So now we are officially a part of the team, and we are in the process of merging platforms and capabilities together, which I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about, at least in a little bit of detail. But that's me.
Yeah. So the idea for this webinar, and you'll have to forgive my guests because I gave them very little details on what we were actually going to talk about prior to the webinar besides the abstract. But I thought this would be a really interesting pairing for the following reason. Jason has this extremely deep offensive security red teaming background. Nick has this really deep kind of blue teaming exposure background and integrating different data sources into a SIEM. And so what strikes me is like you have kind of a really good blue teaming perspective and then also a really good red teaming offensive security perspective. And then we just, I'm a marketing guy, so we layered AI on top of it to make it extra exciting. But so what I thought might be interesting is the other day, Jason presented, or not presented to me, but showed me a presentation that he had built where he went through kind of like 9 layers of attack. I believe specifically in referring to credential operations and how threat actors, whether it's a sophisticated cybercrime group or an APT, would go about doing the reconnaissance necessary to carry out an attack. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and actually show these slides that or the specific graphic in the slides, because I think it's really illustrative and it'll help us kind of frame the conversation and also talk around the different ways that attackers see environments. Can everybody see my screen, or at least Jason and Nick, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Yeah, I don't see it yet. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
So Jason, maybe you could talk just for a couple minutes about kind of the genesis of this slide, what it's trying to convey, and kind of how you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I presented this slide first at SANS Offensive Operations. They do like a regional or national meetup in LA, or they did it this last year at LA. And so they invited a whole bunch of offensive security people to come and present. And one of the things that I had seen, and it bothers me like a little bit in our industry, is kind of this over obsession with the idea that all of the hacks that happen are nation state, 0-day, reverse engineering, very fancy level attacks. And when I was doing red teaming at Buttobot for the past year, I had to dive back into what modern red teaming meant and what modern credential operations looked like for real bad guys. Because when you're red teaming, you want to emulate, the real adversaries. And so when I dove into that research, I started to build out this mental model, and I mind map everything. So this is what it ended up looking like is in a mind map. And what I found out, from my own research, from a whole bunch of survey data that like CISA did and like a whole bunch of places, is really that there are many levels of what end up being a breach for a company, and an order of operations that attackers will go through before they even attempt to really break into a website of yours or a piece of infrastructure. And so I ordered it in levels like a video game because I'm a nerd. And so I started at level 1, which is, level 1 represents kind of credentials that have been leaked and have made it all the way to the public web, meaning like they end up on Pastebin, or they end up in a torrent somewhere, or they're in like Dehashed or one of the hate mail sources, or they're linked on a torrent that you can get off of GitHub or something like that. And so this is usually breach data from a third-party site, from a database that gets dumped on the internet. This is the kind of stuff you'll see Troy Hunt a lot. He'll push out to the industry, which is an amazing service. And so that's like level 1. They'll go rooting around in level 1, but that's not really the freshest of kind of the creds and the initial access that they get. And so then they move on to level 2, which is the dark web forum ecosystem. Level 3, the ransomware as a service ecosystem. And then level 4, where they have a lot of success, is in the Stealer log ecosystem, which happens to live mostly on chats, which is WhatsApp, Telegram, Discord, and some other type of chat interfaces. And then not until level 5 do you see attackers actually want to target an organization with an attack, either a technical attack or in level 6 a phishing attack. And then once you get to level 7, you start seeing more. This is where the nation states, you get a lot of those stories of like, oh, there's a new end day or 0 day, or there was corporate espionage involved or something like that. Then you start to see attackers get down to this level at, level 9. And so, so I started presenting this, and the reaction to this, I don't know if no one's ever kind of broken it down like this, but the reaction to this little mind map I made was tremendous. People were like, holy crap, this exactly encompasses kind of what I was thinking, but it's hard to put it into words. And so I showed it to Eric, and Eric was like, well, this fits exactly with kind of what we think. And so, yeah, that's kind of where the graphic came from.
Yeah, so I'm going to make one comment on it, and then I'm going to also ask Nick for some commentary on maybe some of the trends or some of the examples he's seen in his work at Fortrace on how threat actors kind of leverage this external exposure, right? So I think you're exactly right, Jason. In a lot of cases, people have this kind of mental model where it's like, because all of the focus is on advanced persistent threats, like very sophisticated ransomware groups, but there's a lot of like lower level threat actors, and even the very sophisticated groups will often try the easy stuff first, because why wouldn't you? If you can get in through a password that somebody's reused, or get into a Stealer log that has a lot of corporate credentials, it's a much easier attack than exploiting even a known vulnerability or a 0 day. And so there's this kind of like, there's both the levels. You can see the most sophisticated threat actors may go all the way through 1 through 9, but it's also kind of a nice map of, if you're kind of a moderate sophistication threat actor, you may only try like level 1 through 5, because those are the kind of things you know how to do.
Yeah.
But Nick, I would love some commentary from you on kind of external exposure for companies, and how to think about that, and how you thought about that at Fortrace.
Yeah, I like that you brought up SIMs, because it is of particular note here, which I said to Jason when he showed me this, is that you won't see a log cut. And honestly, sometimes even past this level, you won't see a log cut. But up until level 5, the adversary at really any level of sophistication, this kind of content is accessible, has not cut a log. There is no, you can be logging from every source that cuts a log, from your cloud hosted web proxies to your firewalls to DNS filters to command line logs with every level of auditing, and you will not catch someone going on Telegram and downloading a Stealer log from one of your users who signed into SSO on their laptop, and then their kid wanted some V-Bucks and downloaded a sketchy browser extension, and all of a sudden your credentials are now belonging to one of many groups where this content is exchanged, often for a fee up front, and then after a couple of weeks for free in other groups. These credentials they have a little bit of time on the market, but with a lot of leaks that you see on the big forums, it'll be for sale for a little bit, and then it'll be free. So you pay for access up front when the credentials are fresh and not burnt, and then afterwards they tend to make their way down market. So unless you have credential operations considered in your architecture, which there are obviously ways to. I mean, we're coming from Flare here, where that is something that is a part of our narrative. But if you don't, you won't be seeing evidence until level 5, where if you're collecting different flavors of cloud logs or web proxy logs of your public facing web servers, then you probably won't see portals getting hit yet. And a lot of these portals are cloud hosted, and a lot of people don't collect logs from those. So that's of note. And another emphasis that I like about this is the radical level of simplicity. This a pair of credentials pulled off of a Telegram is like a 16-year-old with one YouTube tutorial away from access to the right corporate asset, especially a cookie. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
No, I only laugh because I felt that pain before, right? Like I've been on the receiving end of that, of the teenager with the YouTube tutorial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is all too common. There are a lot more teenagers with access to YouTube and an interest in offensive security than there are sophisticated threat actors operating with nation state budgets. So in terms of real risks to consider, that is actually up there. And we've seen it. So that's what I'll say. I really like this graphic for that reason.
So Nick, I have a question for you, and I know we were just going to keep this casual. So you said, not a lot of logs generated until level 5, which actually I agree with. The acquisition of the, what you would call these exposures, right? There's no acquisition monitoring for any of this. But when I attempt to start using these on cloud hosted portals, how much noise in like a very, like a standard organization, a decent sized company, do you get with logins? And would you even be able to notice me at level 5 if I'm logging in from an exotic location normally? Like, I mean, I know that logging exists, but how many people actually pay attention to that level of logging?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you're plugging in if what you've gotten from the Telegram group is a web token, is a cookie, then it is so unbelievably unlikely that you'd notice. Okay. That is a level of detection that a lot of people don't employ. That's more likely to be detected sort of automatically than it is by someone who, like at the system or browser level, than by someone who has configured like a correlation rule to detect a change in location on the same session.
Yeah.
But for credentials, there are attacks at this level of sophistication that vary kind of widely in log volume, which like a password spray or credential stuff can definitely generate, you're going to see an increase in compute resource. Even if you're not monitoring for specific attacks, you're not monitoring for a bunch of failed logins from a single, on a single account, or a bunch of failed logins from a single source on different accounts, then if you have sort of like basic, on every cloud service provider, it has a different name, but basic like compute alerts of, you've anomalously gone above your threshold on this particular resource, say like Cognito, if you're using AWS's Cognito for authentication, or just on the web server alone, a sudden spike in traffic. Those spikes, I think more often than not, on like, if you're an Alexa, back in the day, the Alexa top 1 million domain, you're probably seeing enough traffic from the internet that will blend in a small credential stuff, or a small password spray, or a small, something that's not in the millions of attempts. But generally, the smaller you are, or the more, deep behind levels of authentication a particular resource is, the more likely it is to be pretty noticeable. In terms of volume of how many people are collecting and alerting on that content, that varies. And that varies a lot. There are very large organizations who are not alerting at that level of sophistication, and there are very small organizations with nimble teams who are.
Yep. I remember my red teaming activity. I mean, most often we would get caught by automatic impossible travel kind of alerts, and it always depended whether our customer had, what level of, 80% of the world runs on Microsoft, right? So what level of E they had, support they had in Azure, right? So E5 or E4. I remember E3 customers, the basic customers wouldn't even have the impossible travel alert, so we would get in a lot to those kind of customers. And then people who had E5 and then turned it on, we would get blocked by using the creds, but we wouldn't get blocked for injecting the cookies into the browser, which the Stealer logs come with, and then walking right into, they've hooked up Microsoft authentication to their VPN and then walk right into the VPN. So,
a classic.
A classic. It's a classic red teamer move. So one thing I had here is and I know I'm kind of stealing your thunder, Eric. My bad, but
no, please.
So one of the things, at one of my previous organizations that we did, which was tremendously unpopular, I talk about it in talks a lot, but it worked, was the idea that, okay, so let's say you're a user and your kid does download that Robux, Chrome extension, and you get hit with a, Redline or something like that, right? Redline malware info stealer. And so you get hit by it. And then what we made, we made this assumption at this company, but it seemed to hold true, was that it takes the attackers to collect the stealer logs at least about 24 hours to get them on the market, to get them up for sale in the telegrams, or a little bit less sometimes if they have it all automated. So what we did is we instituted a complete cookie refresh at the Microsoft level every 24 hours. 24 hours for computers and 1 week for mobile, because mobile has kind of that walled garden and more exploitation controls and stuff like that. And so all of our users had to log in every day, and they hated it. I mean, the amount of hate mail we got through customer support was very large, but it did save us in 3 or 4 different like additional kind of ransomware attempts, people using these logs, because by the time they got to the ecosystem for sale, they were already invalid. And so have you seen people kind of like, go this way? I mean, I know obscurity is not really, security, but it definitely helped us. So
Yes. And
yeah,
I think,
okay.
interestingly, in the space of cookies, I think different solutions for session continuation will probably become more popular, because you instituting cookies, of course, got removing long sessions was unpopular, and I could see that being unpopular. But it is sort of Google's dream to get rid of session cookies altogether.
Yeah.
And there was a story recently about an API they're introducing for device-based session cookies. So ideally to circumvent the common strategies of stealer logs from being successful, where if someone does get a session token, it's most likely not valid anymore, or the device will detect the attempt to rob the session cookie because it's done outside of the browser context and is accessing the OS to retrieve the cookie from the file system, which makes the surface of detection of the stealer wider, and ideally makes it easier to detect. So everyone's got that in mind. Everyone is considering a reduction in the power of a cookie.
I will interject here very briefly. I have 2 kind of interesting points. I think that so Jason, you mentioned the 24 hours, right? It takes threat actors a little bit because that you have the infection. So a threat actor distributes malware, usually through cracked software malvertising. So you end up with info stealer malware on an endpoint. It has to extract all the data, send it to C2, kind of populate a backend with all of this different types of data. So session cookies, all of the credentials in the browser, et cetera. And then the threat actor has to kind of go and take that and sell that, whether it's on Russian market on the dark web, or whether it's on a Telegram channel. One thing that we've been seeing increasingly is threat actor, like this kind of like new trend of like live Telegram channels. So threat actors are actually just using Telegram API to populate Telegram channels directly with stealer logs that are kind of like brand new. So it's almost as it's happening.
Yeah.
And I think this is exactly to circumvent the kind of controls that companies are putting into place to prevent that from happening. So I thought that was kind of an interesting note.
It's a double-edged sword for me, right? Because I'm still a red teamer, and I still do some consulting, and I want to be able to get in, right? But I want the world to be safer rather than me get in. So, I applaud that, and I cry a little bit at the same time. So, yeah.
I think there's another interesting thing to note here very briefly too, which is especially in these levels 1 through 4, where you have kind of these like really high value stealer logs. Like what we're seeing increasingly, what we've always seen in the ecosystem is anytime there's a data breach with leaked credentials, whatever, it starts out as like pay for this, right? So threat actors are buying like, hey, I have this new breach of all these credentials from this company, and they sell it for $1,000 or whatever the number is. But over time, everything from level 4 trickles back to level 1. So there's this kind of like entropy of information, entropy of leaked credentials, and also now entropy of stealer logs, where stealer logs are increasingly getting kind of repackaged, and then like they kind of float back up to the clear web into these kind of like open web sources or just dark web forum ecosystem where you can download them, because threat actors want to give these away for free to build reputation. And so we see that really commonly too, is like what stays kind of like high class, pretty difficult to access in this level 4 here gets easier over time. And I think that's another pretty important point.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
I was going to say the other interesting note to add there is it's not like once it's reached the public that it becomes any less valuable because it's potentially been burned. If you look at, the anatomy of a session, the anatomy of a Stealer log is usually a lot of different logins to different portals. So now, even though people have already paid for early access to those, it's a much smaller audience. Once it becomes public, it is a much broader audience. And now you've got a lot of people, even if that credential is no longer valid or it's been reset, you've got a lot of people poking and prodding at a lot of different, every corporate login, intranet or public is probably present in a lot of corporate session cookies that we see. There's a pretty wide variety of them. So once it becomes public, you do have a lot more eyes on those resources. And if you're looking for spikes in traffic, you might see the release of a session token coincide with that as a lot of commodity adversaries have scripts to pull the creds, and like it's all automated. There's a lot of automation on the adversary side. Plenty of manual stuff, but just as much of it, especially with stolen and leaked creds, is automated.
It's interesting that we talk about, like some of this will be fresh at like the level 4 level, and then it'll trickle down. And we've talked a lot about, the type of cookies and credentials that lead to like your Azure login or something like that, like your ECS cookie or something like that. But in my red team exposure, I mean, we definitely operated in levels, right? So there was several customers who we ran campaigns against where we would attack their SaaS and not their Azure portal. So their SaaS meaning like one of my most famous ones is we had access to Atlassian services, and I was able to get further malware installed back onto a user that I controlled through a link that I put in their Jira instance. And I said, hey, we need to check this ticket out. And then it popped up my fake Azure login. And then I got a new cookie and a new credential and got them to install a file under a dev package, and then was able to get access to the computer, which then I was able to get access through the VPN into the corporate LAN. And so that leads me to ask the question of like, okay, if attacker, and I mean, and we're just brainstorming here, right? But if attackers, are selling the creds and the cookies in level 4, and that's been their modus operandi for quite a while, what stops them from just selling access directly to the exploited machine at some point, which gives us a hard time, because if the malware is already on there, that means that consumer level defender or whatever consumer level antivirus they have has failed. What stops them from going that way?
Yeah, well, you're right, and they do. You're like, I think, in fact, Eric, though his title is VP of Marketing, is in his own respect a talented security researcher. And Eric and I were talking recently about Eric and I were talking recently about stolen creds and access brokering on particularly Russian-speaking language forums. Yeah. Eric, can you expand a little bit?
So I think there's a lot of interesting things to say about initial access brokers. And just for those who may not be aware, initial access brokers are threat actors who essentially kind of parlay corporate access to corporate networks to ransomware affiliates and other groups who may want it. So they'll kind of establish initial access through a variety of methods, and then to sell it in an auction style format on like 3 main forums: Exploit, XSS, and Ramp. So we see a few different things with initial access brokers. Number one, in a lot of cases, they'll buy bulk Stealer logs. So we've seen initial access brokers directly just kind of go to the source, these vendors who are selling thousands of Stealer logs, many of which contain corporate credentials, and say, I want to buy 100,000 Stealer logs. Like, we'll even see advertisements on some of these forums for that, because then the access broker can go through all of these log files, identify the ones with corporate access, establish the corporate access, and then resell that corporate access on in this auction format. So maybe they pay $2,000 for the Stealer logs, but then they're able to kind of resell the access, parlay it back to a ransomware affiliate, as an example, for $5,000 or $10,000 if it's a really valuable corporate access. Or as Blockbit said in the chat logs, the classy access.
Classy access.
I found that one particularly amusing myself. And then the second kind of piece of the research that was interesting is we wanted to look at if specific initial access brokers were actually targeting like NATO critical infrastructure. So we did a really big data analysis on the ecosystem. We looked at almost 700 initial access broker posts across multiple forums. And then we kind of established a baseline, like, okay, 14% of all posts contain access to NATO critical infrastructure. So 14% of all initial access broker sales are selling access to NATO critical infrastructure. And then we went and looked, okay, are there specific actors that are kind of like deviating from this average substantially? And we saw that 2 specifically were selling NATO critical infrastructure, like 35 to 50% of all of their listings were NATO critical infrastructure, and they had a lot of listings. And so that kind of brings in like this geopolitics component too, where even though cybercrime isn't necessarily geopolitically motivated, it's almost entirely financially motivated. There probably is a geopolitical element to it, especially for some of these more sophisticated actors.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear, right? Because in my mental model, I had completely siloed this to credential operations and credential sale. But no, you're absolutely right. They're one and the same, and you could just pivot to being a different type of vendor at some point. So the whole ecosystem is absolutely fascinating. One of the reasons I came to Flare to work with you guys, because it's like I feel like, like I said in the beginning, a lot of red teams and offensive security people, they talk about emulating the adversaries. It's a huge like catchphrase right now, is like, act like a bad guy, be a red teamer. And it's like, I really wish that people would, understand that this is actually how bad guys work, rather than, like I was talking to Nick before the show about, a lot of these campaigns, these adversaries really don't even have structured C2, right? And when you get into the red teaming world, C2 meaning command and control servers, when you get in the red teaming world, like that's all they teach you is like how to set up Cobalt Strike, and like how to set up, Mythic, and like, all these C2s, and they're really fancy and they're really cool, but it's not actually what's happening on the bad guy internet. So it's always tickled my brain a little bit.
And a particularly interesting evolution of Crown Jewels is like the most talked about Crown Jewel of the past was getting DA, becoming a domain administrator.
Oh, I don't need DA anymore. Like,
exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's like first of all, who's, to your Atlassian example, what an incredible volume of internal, sensitive, proprietary, and potentially intellectual property information it lives in a Confluence instance. And there's no one's collecting the 4624 equivalent on and 4625 on Atlassian, which is like authentication failures and successes, or anomalies in authentication activity, because that's a SaaS product. You're not collecting. People do, but overwhelmingly, people do not feel responsible for, as extremely understandably, don't feel responsible for the the maintenance of authentication security in their SaaS products. So an adversary, without cutting a log that you collect, can successfully access Atlassian with potentially a stolen cookie, or potentially an active login with No2FA enabled, and leave with all your internal wiki data, and no one's the wiser to it. With a lack of internal compromises, generate so many logs. There are so many interesting ways to detect them, as you should. Those detections should be in place, and are very fun to investigate. But the modern surface is a lot different with a lack of internal log collection.
So I have this catchphrase that I got from 2 trainers I met at a conference called Hack RedCon last year, and these guys they're full-time red teamers, and I sat in their training, and they did this training on modern internals, they called it, like modern internal pen tests, right? And so you do have this old guard of pen testers and red teamers who will focus entirely on getting DA, right? That's what they've been trained on since they've taken their OSCP, right? And I sat with these guys and we were talking about that. Once I've broken through the hard armor of an organization, I've gotten initial access to the VPN and the internal network, I am not doing anything to make any noise that I'm using. In the catchphrase is browser and a dream. I have a browser and a dream, and that's all I need usually to find internally leaked credentials. I mean, once I'm on the internal, there's a whole bunch of systems you can target. I was talking to Eric the other day about one of the more modern ones that I've seen. I saw this at Blue Hat. I saw a researcher talk about this. Is all of these companies, even ours included, right, which we have to be cognizant about at Flare, but are working to integrate AI features into their products, which means they're doing a whole
Jason.
bunch of...
I was gonna move us there next.
All
but you
good.
beat me
All
to
good.
it.
No, it's all good. I mean, this will dovetail. I didn't do it on purpose, but this will dovetail. So they're training all their models internally, and so in order to train, you have to have these test harnesses that are open source software. Normally, unless you're paying a big company, and so what you end up is on the internal land, you have these web apps basically that have no authentication. Some of these training harnesses have no authentication at all, and they house all of your data so that you can train your AI models on it. And so as a red teamer, I've walked into some organizations and specifically looked for these web apps, and then it's game over. I have everything. Like I have all of the data that you have data laked into one of these AI training tools. And then it's like, okay, so I didn't need DA. I got everything I needed from this silly web app that you guys have rushed to implement internally to train your AI model. So it's been fantastic from a red teamer point of view, really scary from a corporate point of view as well. So
yeah, I like the story. Eric, you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just going to say very quickly to your point earlier, Nick, on SaaS applications versus kind of like domain admin. I think it's a really, really good one. So we did some research on this last year, actually, as a company. And what we found, I think, 250,000 SaaS logins in our Sealer Logs data set. We only looked at like 8 SaaS B2B business used SaaS applications. So we looked at stuff like HubSpot, Salesforce, like these big CRM applications. And I would hazard a guess for a lot of organizations, it's worse for somebody to get access to all of your HubSpot data than for all of your like Google Drive data.
Salesforce has been really a big one for our red teaming campaigns, or for my red teaming campaigns. Is that's actually worse for them to get access to their Salesforce data than anything else sometimes. Yeah, and then we had some really good success with infrastructure mind mapping tools like Miro, where people would just dump creds in these graphics that they were making to show their network diagram or something like that. And that was a SaaS. And with a lot of these SaaS, right, you can't, they don't even have logging, first of all. Like even if you wanted logging, they don't have logging for these SaaS platforms, and you have to pay to get 2-factor authentication for them, or to apply them to SSO or whatever authentication scheme you're going to run. You have to pay extra money for that feature for some of these SaaS. So a lot of people don't, which is a crime. Honestly, I feel like it's horrible. But yeah.
Well, I don't want to take us too deep into the AI conversation, but I think the risks, the AI app risks, are in many cases, like the ones you mentioned, Jason, radically unsexy, and are not like less the poisoning of vector data and more like extremely hype AI apps, like riding the hype train, spin up with radically insecure, I'll say, or unconfigured rather than misconfigured infrastructure, where like some blob storage or some bucket which stores, the log history of someone's prompt and response data is public and indexed by a search engine. Like these are like credential exposures for these apps, and the classical leakage of data, like not in a sense that is any different from regular web app data leakage, are like some of the more serious risks that impact every web application. AI web apps not being unique, their data being unique, in that I can't even imagine the amount of people who paste secrets like API tokens, credentials in scripts that they're plugging in either intentionally or automatically through a number of code assist apps into these prompts. So I'm sure the wealth of the exposure vectors are very, very similar to classical web apps, but the data is unique and in the adversary's hands, super, super interesting.
I think this is actually an interesting pivot. I'd like to dive into this in a few minutes, because this was kind of one of the big strengths of Fortrace, and where you had a lot of the unique intellectual property that Fortrace developed, if I'm not mistaken, Nick, was in this kind of identifying like this data exposure that's not necessarily credentials, which is what we've talked about a lot so far, but where companies have individuals at companies or companies themselves have misconfigured something. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and then maybe we can go back and get Jason's perspective on the red teaming aspect of finding these types of things?
Yeah, our emphasis. This is kind of one of the many reasons that there was such a symbiosis between Flare and Fortrace, is both of us have such a strong emphasis on data. Flare's being unmatched in the world of credential exposures, and really of many of the categories that you consider EASM. Fortrace is being data leaks from corporate resources, which is part of why the marriage is so successful, and why we're so excited about it. Me particularly am so excited about it. is a big part of what we did at Fortrace was looking for exposed content in like misconfigured file shares on web resources, which a lot of the times ends up being a SharePoint directory that someone clicked share via URL on to give to a consultant. Incidentally, has exposed an entire directory of financial audit files that are supposed to be going to EY or KPMG, but have been indexed by Google and are searchable by anyone. So a very, very simple Google dork of domain file type, domain, or, the site is companyname.com, file type XLSX, file type docx, file type PDF. These are ancient Google dorks that are still so powerful. And Bing dorks, by the way, just as powerful, if not sometimes more on Bing, because Google does a lot of filtering, trying to be mindful of people adversarially dorking, which is great. But these are still radically successful vectors, and those are some of the ones that Fortrace put an emphasis on, because collaboration suites like Google Docs, SharePoint, and then a lot of the collaboration apps that leverage your classic infrastructure as a service providers to host content are famously very leaky because users have a lot of control, and it's not something that is usually top of mind to configure those controls, but they are configurable. You can disable public link sharing. You can force it to be identity based, which is really the recommendation there is share with an identity. Don't share a URL publicly, because those are being spidered. Those are being crawled and lead to a lot of issues.
Yeah, and now I would ask Jason for the red teaming approach. Like, as a red teamer, how does he think about finding this kind of like data exposure that's maybe not threat actor generated?
So what you guys call like external attack surface management, and then like configuration kind of mismanagement, and then all the stuff you were talking about, Nick, which actually the story between I actually met Nick last year. I met Nick at B-Side San Francisco. We were right next to each other at B-Side San Francisco, and we vibed really hard on recon stuff, and so I was so happy to hear that the acquisition had gone through. But like this type of stuff, my bag. Recon, like, definitely my strong suit in the red teaming world. And like there are some rabbit holes you can go down to. So one you talked about is object storage, right? And there are some very well-known object storage kind of categorizers out there that do this. But there's also things like that I've seen direct breaches come from, which is like Docker Hub, right? You would be surprised how many developers will Docker up some code and upload it to Docker Marketplace, and it's either, first of all, they're violating the license because it's proprietary code that they're getting from another place that they're buying, or they hard code secrets in it, or it's custom code that they've written for their organization but accidentally Dockered it up, and then you can look at it and reverse engineer it for exploitation. And so that is a very common bug hunter method and red teamer method, is to look at Docker. A new kind of one that's kind of out there these days, and if there's any bug hunters out there, this is a freebie, but the AWS AMSI marketplace as well is the same kind of idea, as well as everybody knows about GitHub, right? GitHub, like you're looking for creds on GitHub and stuff, and Flare does a phenomenal job of parsing GitHub. So yeah, these are all like esoteric places that you can go and kind of grab in the red teaming world, and hopefully find, my first goal when I go to these places is creds, and then custom code that these people have written that maybe I can exploit pretty easily by doing quick code review. And then if not, like I'll have to spend longer time to, parse it. But you get lucky, you get paths, you get like, secret debug parameters that they've hidden in their app sometimes. It's amazing the kind of stuff you can get when you're looking at source code. So.
Another classic is in the CI/CD world, Jenkins servers. Famously, the no-fly list leak was a file called nofly.csv in an exposed Jenkins server from a small airline. So these are another radically simple, dorkable or Shodan queryable method of finding things in the CI/CD / like container world.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting point that goes back to kind of the diagram earlier too here, as we're talking about, we've talked a lot about credentials, we've talked a lot about external exposure. My personal view, and I'd be curious to get your agreement or disagreement, is that those two right there make up the vast majority of attacks. Like vast majority of attacks are not like custom, like spear phishing campaigns that are really detailed and sophisticated, or exploiting 0-day or in-day vulnerabilities. It's really like identifying kind of like threat actors are lazy. Like why go through the trouble of doing something hard if you can do something easy? So identify the easy stuff and get in with that, because oftentimes that works.
Yeah, one of the things in my latest talks that I've been deving, which is I call it credential operations, and I go over a lot of this stuff, is attackers are pragmatic and lazy. Like they will do what they need to do to get in, but they're not gonna. It's kind of like a business, right? Like, are you going to invest, $150,000 of research time into a 0-day, or are you going to go out and try to buy a cred for $10 off of Russian market? They're opportunists, and so I definitely agree there. I'd be interested to hear what Nick has to say though as well.
Yeah, I think things have gotten a lot simpler for adversaries, and kind of a joke that I sometimes make to sort of poke fun at, but also take seriously the idea of like the development world has shifted left, and that we're trying to, or is saying shift left a lot, of like moving security into the development lifecycle process. Adversaries have also shifted left in that they front load in a totally different way, which is they front load. This is something I've picked up on the forums. They front load campaigns with reconnaissance now a lot more than they used to, because why not? The volume you can get in with. I mean, we've discussed, and you can find no shortage of news articles from probably the last couple months demonstrating this. But with an incredibly small amount of information and the right SaaS portals, you can get in, get your crown jewels, and get out with very quickly and very easily. So the front loading of reconnaissance is a noticeable trend, and one that for adversaries makes sense, as the proliferation of cloud-based infrastructure makes the logging landscape look different, and makes it puts a lot more applications, gives them routes to the internet that maybe a decade ago didn't exist, when they were sitting in a data center racked and stacked with no theoretical path to the internet, and now there are many theoretical paths to the internet for those sensitive apps.
It's really interesting, because one of the things I say to people a lot of times is the bigger you are, the harder it is to secure your organization, right? And so I have been in this. I was part of HP, Ubisoft, and when you start working with organizations that have gobbled up hundreds of acquisitions, or have grown to multinational level, it is really freaking hard to secure your external, right? Like, you have so many domains, so many subdomains, you have so many business units that end up just putting a new website online that hasn't gone through security review, that doesn't have two-factor authentication hooked up, or they buy some SaaS, and like, unless you are one of the top 2% in the world of those companies, like, there's not a lot of companies who track through finance what SaaS are being procured, and so these are security program little pieces that you have to build, and you only feel the pain from some of these when you get breached, right? You get breached through one of these methods, and then you're like, oh crap, yeah, it made total sense for us to do that, but we didn't do it, and so now we have to pay a little bit of pain. So it's really interesting. The bigger you are, the harder you fall sometimes. And so when I get a giant red team scope, or when I get like a bug bounty hunt that is on a giant recon target, you'd be so surprised about the kind of stuff that's on the internet, man. Like, people just throw it up there, and like, it's public to everybody, sometimes with no auth, default credentials, whatever. It's pretty scary.
Yeah.
All right, so I think I'll steer the conversation in the last part to the real AI piece, and a lot of people have talked about already, and I don't think we need to go there, like all of the offensive uses for AI, right? Like, in terms of phishing campaigns, like there's a lot of fairly obvious ones. I think what I'd like to do is talk about kind of in generally, as a security company or as a security practitioner, what are good uses of AI versus bad uses of AI? Like, how can you leverage some of these to your benefit as a security practitioner, and then where are some companies maybe going wrong? And because there's this kind of like gold rush to AI right now, where every company's implementing it. Many of them, in my case, not even in security generally, are like, does that use case really make sense, or is it just kind of like we need to have AI, so we'll put AI like over here because this is now we're an AI company too. So I would love to get both of your thoughts on some like effective ways to implement AI. And I think, Jason, you have a course on this coming up too, as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so I've been working inside the generative AI space for about a year and a half now. So I helped host the largest red teaming event um, for the kind of what you would call like very accepted models. So GPT with OpenAI and Anthropic's models and something like that as part of DEF CON's AI Village. And so basically what we did is we had a whole bunch of people roll through DEF CON, some of the best hackers in the world, sit down at a laptop and try to break the current like consumer models that were out. And we had tremendous success doing that, and then release the data to obviously the the manufacturers of those models. And so yeah, I think that AI is a double-edged sword, but I think the practical application, and I actually differ in this view than a lot of people. I think actually blue teamers, defenders, might actually gain more from AI if we can help steer the trajectory that way than I think attackers will. I've heard a lot of people say that attackers are going to benefit and it's going to be really bad before it gets better by using AI. And you illustrated the phishing concept, right? But and there are some really nefarious ways and access that the bad guys can use AI for, but I think there's infinitely more ways to secure organizations on the blue team side than there is bad. And so, some of those are some of the things that AI is really great at is documentation and coding, right? And that is actually, if you zoom in on a lot of problems we have as an industry, it's secure coding, it's really bad documentation, it's lack of guardrails, it is lack of training, and AI can supercharge all of that across your organization for a security program. And so what I talk about in the class is like, okay, so let's take everybody's day job that they have right now and how can we supercharge it with AI? And when it gets down to the level of like, okay, what are we actually doing? It's like creating great documentation, creating development guides, creating custom code that we can deploy across the whole organization really quickly, creating scanners that will identify things quicker than the bad guys. And yeah, so I really do think that Blue is going to have a fantastic next couple of years in the generative AI landscape.
Nick,
Yeah,
your thoughts?
I think
It's kind of like the offense defense balance for AI. It's an
Yeah,
interesting question.
yeah,
I think my answer is I mean very similar. I think the least controversial and sort of undeniably the most agreed upon positive uses for generative AI for defense is write me a POC script to do X, Y, or Z. Like get me started and explain how you got there. And also the sort of like explain like I'm five scenarios. Like explain to me a pass the hash attack, like using example as if it's, some fantasy scenario to help me digest it better. Those are things it's good at. Of course, you want to check and make sure it's not hallucinating you any inaccurate information there, but like with as long as you're looking at those things with a critical lens and with a bit of a grain of salt that there's assume like a little bit of a plus or minus difference of what might be accurate or inaccurate. Those are great ways that you can very casually use AI to just move faster. And not, if there's questions that you're not finding an adequate answer to, and you've scrolled through Stack Overflow, like 15 different threads, and everyone's being really flippant in them, then like you just take it to a generative AI, plug in the question, and it'll give you a very nice answer that will at least send you down, hopefully the right path.
I think one of the amazing things is we're very fortunate. I didn't have this when I was coming up, but we're very fortunate now to have a full stack of open source defensive tools now, right? Like you don't have to have budget to buy a Splunk, although I love Splunk, right? I mean, Splunk is a great SIM, but there are open source tools that can do the same stuff. And so I think that, one of the things I talk about a lot is building, as long as there's documentation out there and it's in the general training data for all of these models, and you can, also train post-train some models on security stuff, and then vectorize all of your documentation and API docs. You can build defensive tools faster than everything. So like OS Query is a good example. That's pretty much free. Nuclei for vulnerability scanning. You have different layers of retest stuff, like all the atomic red team stuff and Caldera stuff, you can make atomics really easily, which are retests for, or regression tests basically for security issues. You can make all of those templates really easily through AI. And so that's kind of why my brain shift happened, was that like, oh, defense is going to gain a lot from this rather than offense. So yeah.
So I think we'll end on a question we have, which is, has anyone seen evidence of attackers using AI effectively in the wild? And I can say, like, I did see a news story, not anything specifically Flare related, but a news story on either an individual or group that used voice cloning software to, I think it was for a financial scam against a company that resulted in millions of dollars of losses. And I actually think that's where we're going to see a lot of the most salient damage first, is the voice, because being able to clone somebody's voice in 30 seconds makes for amazing social engineering. But I'd love to hear Nick and then Jason.
Yeah, I mean, there are actually a lot of models for sale with full blown like ChatGPT, sophisticated chatbot interfaces that are very simple and easy to use for sale on the dark web. I think Dark Gemini was a recent one, but there's a bunch. And so I think a lot of the actual examples of probably what Dark Gemini's help people do are not something that's necessarily extremely public. It's like in the attacker's playbook. I'm sure there are examples. And also, great question, Andy. And that is the coolest profile picture I've ever seen. For anyone just listening, it's a picture of someone like grinding a handrail on skates while playing guitar. So well done, Andy. Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to just be the dude who agrees, right? But absolutely, I think that social engineering and scamming will get the biggest boon in the bad guy world. I do also think that LLMs in certain cases are superpowers when it comes to parsing data. And so all this data that these attackers have started collected, system data through Redline and malware stealers and stuff like that, info stealers, they're going to be able to parse it a lot better. And they're going to be able to apply it to their campaigns a lot better. And they're going to be able to phish people a lot better. And so those like, it's always a cat and mouse game. It's been like that since I've been in security. But it will be a boon to them as well. So but yeah, the phishing stuff and like actual examples, right? Like it didn't make newsworthy, right? But one of my personal friends' parents got hit by a voice cloning service to say, hey, I'm in jail, can you please forward bail money to this account, so I can bail myself. And they didn't get hit where they actually lost the money, but they definitely got attacked and said it sounded just like the person, and it sounded just like their son. And so yeah, it was really eye-opening for me to understand that scammers are on the tip really fast. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jason and Nick. Do you guys have any last words before we wrap it up?
Thanks for listening. I mean, if you on a marketing note,
you're gonna be the marketing guy, Nick.
That's I'll take the pressure off you for a second. If you're wondering if you've been impacted by any of these things, any of the leaks we've talked about or haven't talked about, Flare is a great place to start. So
yeah, we have
feel
a free
free to
trial.
reach out.
You don't even have to take a sales call. You can sign right up and see if it works for you, and then decide you want to take a sales call, which you definitely
very proud
will.
of that fact.
Awesome.
I'm not going to be markety, but I definitely want to say super happy to have Nick aboard. I think that ASM and exposure management, I think, are two things that have been on a collision course to make like a super powered platform. And I'm really glad that's going to happen at Flare, because they're two of my passions. And so, I mean, just as a user of Flare, as a red teamer, putting aside for a second that, I am the field CISO part-time, keep an eye out, because there's some cool stuff coming for sure.
Agreed. And thanks. I'm excited to be here. This is an incredibly talented team and a very, very cool company with an awesome mission. So I'm psyched.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining, and have a fantastic day.
Thanks all.